I knew that one day my goal in life is just to make a living reading and writing books. I knew the author part was the hard part. How do you write a book? How do you sell a book? I didn't know anything about that, but I did have a background in marketing.
You've built a very significant author platform by just sharing the interesting things you were reading, the highlights, the quotes, the takeaways, the insights. It's 150,000 people on Instagram, 50,000 on Twitter, 10,000 on email, top 1% podcasts about books, writing, learning. And this is all nonfiction, which is very unusual. Meanwhile, every author is saying, I don't have time to build an author platform, but you've done it as a side effect of what we're already doing. Can you talk through how that worked and what your journey to it was?
So I knew one day I'm going to write a book and it would be a lot easier to sell it if I have audience. Okay, let me just build that audience part first. And I love reading. So I figured, why don't I just share my recommendations with people online? So I started a website, alexandbooks.com, started the Instagram page, and just started sharing like, hey, I enjoyed this book. Check out my 10 favorite quotes from it. Or here are 5 books about productivity or 5 books on psychology that I really enjoyed that I think you should check out. So it was more like a curation process. I was curating the books I was reading. So I was like, why don't I just share it with people online? And it really resonated with people. It just started growing and growing. And now that I'm publishing my own books, it comes in handy that I have this large audience because I built up, years and years of connections with people.
I think comes in handy is wildly understating the benefit. It makes me feel so bad in a good way, because I'm like, man, how many books have I read while doing the research for the ones I've written? Like I could have just been sharing my research, my notes, my takeaways. It sounds too good to be true. It sounds too easy. What does this actually feel like?
Well, the disclaimer here is I've been running Alex and Books for over 4.5 years now. So this has been like a long process. And that's the one thing when it comes to building an audience, like it does not happen overnight. And even if you go viral, the faster you gain your audience, also the faster you lose them. But if you have a long-term relationship, you see them every day or every 2 days on social media, instead of just random people, they become followers and fans and sometimes even friends over time. So definitely a long-term process behind that.
Let's shift to the books themselves. I want to talk about 3 aspects of the reader experience: the recommendability, the engagement, and the credibility of the author. And let's start with recommendability. What's the book that you recommend most often, or you hear recommended most often within your communities of readers?
Well, definitely in the nonfiction space, I would put Atomic Habits really high up there. Everyone has habits and everyone wants to build better habits. So that's the type of book that literally can apply to every single person.
I completely agree. I hear that one all the time. I love this example because there's a lot of books about habits, but we only ever hear about one of them, which is Atomic Habits.
Yes.
So this actually allows us to draw out the diff, right? Because it's clearly not the topic. It's something that James Clear did with the way he wrote it, the way he presented it. If you think about it, like Charles Duhigg wrote The Power of Habit a few years earlier, and all of these books were based off the same research, which had been around for decades. Are you able to identify anything out of James Clear's book that sort of makes it more recommendable than the others in the same space?
I've really been thinking deeply about this. And I think what it comes down to, even though the information and the facts are the same, people remember the story behind Atomic Habits. Like if I say the 1% rule, you think about the English bicycling team that got 1% better. If I think about change your environment, you think about that lady in the hospital put out more water bottles, and that's how people started drinking healthier. And it's not really just the facts. People don't remember the facts. They remember the story that goes along with the facts. And what James Clear did really smartly is that he wrote blog posts, and he could kind of tell which blog posts were most popular. Then he put those into the book. And the blog posts that didn't perform well, either he changed the story or he just didn't include those chapters in the book.
I've been through this myself, right? There's almost a blank space in the book where you're like, story goes here, but the metaphors, the anecdotes, they're the delivery mechanism for the message. And I think one of the reasons that my first book, The Mom Test, stuck so well is because I've been teaching it for a while and I'd gone through so many different metaphors. I had like a dartboard metaphor, I had a gift-giving metaphor. And I was like, okay, that worked with 20% of the audience. That worked with 40% of the audience. And I sort of worked those metaphors and the anecdotes. And eventually I'm like, okay, that works with like 90% of the audience. That's it. And of course, it still flops for some people. I don't know if it's possible to get like 100% story stick rate. It reminded me also of, I don't know if you've read April Dunford's book, obviously awesome, but she uses the weirdest examples, but they work so well. And when we talked to her, I'm like, you must have taught this a lot, right? And she's like, oh yeah, those examples took years to get to.
That's something I'm seeing with more authors now. You mentioned Nir Eyal. What he does before he writes the book is he teaches workshops, and similar to what you did. And yeah, you want to constantly refine your information, see what sticks, see what people resonate with, see what people don't like, and cut that part out. There's a great new book that just came out, The Minimalist Entrepreneur by Sahil Lavigna, the CEO of Gumroad. And he does the same thing.
We had him on just before you. He was here 2 weeks ago.
Super smart guy. Talks about how to build like a business like in 2021 and beyond. If you're going to write a book, like come up with a draft, teach it like as a workshop, see what sticks, see what doesn't. cut out, what people don't like, refine what's not working, and just kind of like build off that. And like you said in your own book, you want to get feedback before you publish, because that way you can still edit it. But once it's published, it's a lot harder, and you don't want to get feedback too late in the process.
As a reader, how early in the book do you start rolling your eyes and go like, oh man, this is going to be hard work to get through?
I have 3 strike rules, 3 chapters and you're out. Like the introduction should kind of set up what I will learn. If I'm not interested by the first chapter, that's a problem, because that's usually where the author spends most of the time. And then I'll give it like a 3rd strike. So if there's like a chapter later on in the book or something that interests me, I'll read that chapter. And if I'm still not interested in the book by then I'm like, all right, this book has to go.
I've become so impatient with long-winded authors. And occasionally I used to think if there's one good idea in a book, it's worth my 8 hours of reading it or whatever. And that's still true when you think about it. But in practice, those hours of suffering through just needless words, they frustrate me so much now. I just can't do it to myself.
That's why I really enjoyed the tip you shared in your book. You kind of want to front load the information. Even if only the first third of your book is awesome, the rest isn't. If I recommend the book to someone, I just say, hey, just read the first 3 chapters. They'll be like, okay, cool. But if you kind of spread out all the gems, I'm not going to say, hey, read page 15, then go to page 58, then go to page 103. That's way too complicated. So just like front load the information, give them the value. And that's kind of like your best bet.
Yeah, I've never gotten mad at a book because of a bad ending. I mean, maybe a novel. I've gotten mad at novels because of bad endings, but oh, this nonfiction book, the appendix was terrible.
Yeah.
As long as it gives me something useful at the beginning. Something that so many authors seem to struggle with, and I'm interested in your perspective here, is they feel like they have to go above and beyond to explain their credentials early on, their expertise, their history, why you should listen to them, why it's going to be worth your time.
You do want to have like credible source, but I think the back of the book where you have the author bio, or maybe in the intro you just mention like a couple of sentences, but really at the end of the day, the story and the facts speak for itself. And yeah, if you really quote a research article or something, people aren't going to look it up, and it'll be up to the person whether they believe you or not.
I was thinking about it today, and I think that to me, your readers start out believing in you, and your job as the author is to not lose or break their faith. Whereas I feel like many authors begin believing they have 0 credibility and they need to build the credibility. And I think by the time they pick up the book, they're already like, this person presumably knows something, right? You just need to not prove them wrong. Marketing. As far as I've been able to tell, there's 3 ways to grow a book. You can have a large platform, reputation, email list, etc. You can have lucky PR and succeed in riding that wave very skillfully. Not to diminish that, it's hard, right? That's a skill. And then the third one is the book can kind of grow beyond you, where it's recommendable, long-lasting, back catalog, etc. Whichever you choose, you need to do something. I call it seed marketing. You need to make the original group know about it. I had never thought about influencer marketing before. And, you are an influencer in the book space. You do a mix of organic reviews because you love the book and paid reviews where you work with the author. But can you talk about kind of how that works? Which authors is it good for? Which authors is it bad for?
I could think influencers like micro brands in the sense where like if an author comes to me and they have a fiction book or they have like a memoir, I just tell them like, hey, this is not the right audience for me. I'm not going to take your money. So you really want to look at influencers and see if they are a good fit for your brand. And then also when it comes to influencers, it's not just how many followers they have, but like looking at their engagement as well, because someone might have a larger following, but if their audience isn't engaged, that book's not going to perform well. The easiest influencer marketing you can do is just find influencers in like your genre or space that you think would be a good fit and just be like, hey, is it cool if I like send you a free copy of the book? Like if you want to share, read it with the audience, that would be awesome. The disclaimer, like the bigger audience they have, the more likely they'll ask for payment for the review, because like myself, I get like 10 book review requests every day and I just can't go through all of them. I have to like filter each one. And like you said, I have to do a background about the author. Is this person credible? Is this book like a right fit for me? And then even sometimes the first thing I do is like, okay, send me a free copy of the book and then we can move forward from there. And then sometimes I look through the book and I'm like, this is not a good self-published book. Like there's spelling mistakes, it's badly printed or something like that. So it is like a multi-step process.
Everything's time and money versus exposure and sales. I'm sure there's any number of people out there who will promise big results and take your money. Do you have any advice about how authors should be evaluating and sanity checking on their end to see if it's someone good to be working with?
What you want to do is find a bunch of influencers in your space and first offer the book for free, see if they say yes to that. If not, ask them what kind of prices are. Get prices from multiple influencers that we could compare, see which ones you could work with. You could look at their past posts to see how well the performance does. You want to make sure you get the specifics of the deal if you're going to pay them. For me, I always do a carousel Instagram post. I do like a story post with a link to the Amazon page. and then also link in the bio, because you don't want just exposure for your book. You want to get sales and you want to drive that audience to buy the book. So you really want to make that clear up front. It's like, hey, this is what I'm looking for in this deal. Like, can you provide that? And then there's also been sometimes with authors where we work on a per sale basis. So they'll give me a cut of the ebook sales for the week or something like that. So that way it's more like a win-win situation. There's also been posts where I just did cash up front and the post went viral and the author just wanted to do 2 or 3 more posts because the book performed just so well. It's sometimes hard to tell what books will perform well and some books won't. But like I said, find multiple influencers, see how much they charge, maybe work with 1 or 2 of them, see what the results are on the sales side. And then, if you enjoyed working with them, do another promo in the future.
It's just one of those things. It wasn't in my orbit before bumping into you. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Spend money on advertising and it's a different sort of thing. So back to the books. What's the last book you read that completely surprised you, either in its impact, its style, its unusualness?
Lately, I've been actually spending more time rereading books because I find like if you really find an amazing book, just like an amazing movie, it's worth watching more than once. And same thing goes for books. So I've been rereading One Thing because I just had the author on my podcast. And I also been reading Atomic Habits. And just like this time, I got a second copy, brand new. And I'm trying to figure out how can I apply every single habit rule that James talks about to becoming a reader. So that's kind of been a mission I've been on.
Nassim Nicholas Taleb, he's like, when it comes to books, ignore the star rating, ignore the recommendations, ignore everything. The only data that matters is how many times people reread it.
And best books are worth rereading multiple times. As a book influencer, I say I battle with because the authors that have these great books, like James Clear is not going to pay me to like review their book or anything like that. So it's like this balance of recommending great books that are worth rereading multiple times, and then like, hey, here's this new author that has a really great book, even though they're self-publishing or they're publishing for the first time. They deserve some exposure or credit because they really put in this work to write a great book. And I found multiple self-published authors who really wrote a great book, but they literally have no audience whatsoever. So I've been helping them build their brand or spread the word about their book.
What do you wish that authors did differently? I'm talking both like the mainstream authors. Like for me, my personal pet peeve is everyone tries to imitate Malcolm Gladwell's style. And I'm like, get your own style. You have a natural voice and it's probably not Gladwell's. But what do you wish authors knew?
I'll go with big authors first. I really wish their books were shorter. Like each book that's published is like 250 pages. Well, it could be like 150 or 200 pages. That's why I really respect Seth Godin. He writes all these marketing books like The Dip, The Tribe, and they're super short books. And it's like, you wrote a super short book, so the value is each page. Because you respected my time, I'm going to respect yours and like buy more of your books. Another thing, I really like it when a chapter has key takeaways at the end or like a recap. It's just like a simple way of saying, here are the main lessons in the chapter. It's also super helpful at the end of the book. And this is also what self-published authors could do. At the end of the book, also include, here are the main takeaways of this book, the main lessons, and maybe even go one step further. Not just here's the information, but here's how you could actually apply it. Because that's what readers want. They want results. Learning new information feels good, but if you actually get a reader to apply your book or lessons from your book, they'll remember that book forever. Because then if someone says, oh, how'd you pick up that habit of drinking more water? Oh, I read this book. And not only are you talking about the book, you're also talking about the change and transformation you experience. So that's super cool.
That creates evangelists. If someone reads an interesting idea, they go, interesting. Maybe they recommend it in like an academic, philosophical way. But if you actually touch someone's life, if you change their behavior, if they achieve a win that they wouldn't have won otherwise and they attribute it to you, woo, that's an evangelist for life, right?
100%. Yeah, that's how you build super fans. And then like self-published authors, so they could basically apply all those rules we just listed. And then I would say style is probably optional. What people look for is novelty and interesting story or just interesting facts. And the way you phrase it, someone will listen to interesting story from person, even if like they're stuttering, as long as it's interesting. Like you hear Elon Musk talk, he's not the best speaker, but he always has like interesting story or facts to share. So as a self-published author, don't worry too much about the narrative or even using specific grammar. Don't get too hung up on how you're explaining your story. As long as you have interesting information, I think readers will find it eye-catching and grabbing, and keep it short, cut out the fluff. They'll probably enjoy your book. And also, you really want to build a great cover. There was this self-published author who I really loved their book, and he showed me the first cover he had for the book, and it was like absolutely terrible. And it's really amazing how much a book could change and like how much more it'll sell if you just improve the cover on it. So I would say definitely don't skimp out on the cover, because even if you have a fantastic book, if you have a cover that does not attract people, people won't ever get into the door. to like even start reading your book?
The cover's such an interesting thing because in my heart, I want to believe it doesn't matter. And if someone gets a one-on-one recommendation, I think it doesn't matter because they go, whatever, I'm going to give it a try. My business book is bright pink. It doesn't look like a business book, but people get it as a recommendation. They go, fine. However, it's super important in the Amazon age and for discovery because your cover is your advertising image, your search result image. If the cover is not descriptive and clickable and professional, people just stop there, right? It's never your book being evaluated in a vacuum. It's always your book being evaluated against the 10 or 30 other books that are visible on that Amazon page. And like thumbnail size is this big, And that's another mistake is I think authors make covers sometimes that look beautiful as a poster. But you don't see things on Amazon as posters. They're 218 pixels tall. Like that's how you should be designing your cover. Something about readers' behavior that would surprise or shock or dismay or encourage the average author.
I think you have a really important point to make in the book, and you'll see this in James Clear's book. If he has a really great sentence, every action you take is a vote for the person you want to become. He'll put it on a sentence by itself between like 2 paragraphs. And you'll also include it in like the key takeaways at the end of the chapter. If you really have a great point, you want to repeat it multiple times so it sticks with the reader. And you also want to make it visibly stick out. So that way you get their full attention. And in terms of social media, you want to have those sentences that are quotable. Because you'll see when people share on social media, like I just shared the book, The Alchemist, and he has that famous line, when you want something, the whole universe conspires to help you achieve it. And that's something that everyone knows. When they hear that quote, they think of the book. So you want to have like quotable lines throughout your book, I would say. And one great way to test this is Twitter. If you tweet a sentence from your book and it goes viral, that's something you want to include in your book. You could have this feedback loop where you just share parts of your book on Twitter and just see how well they perform. And the better they perform, the more you would want to include them in your book.
I've been reading a lot on Kindle now, and there's a popular highlights feature, right? Which shows you the most popular highlights within the book. And I turned it off because I always found it distracting. And then when I was thinking about doing the second edition of my first book, like the 10-year anniversary edition, I was like, wait, I want to make sure I don't destroy any of these memorable quotes. So I turned it back on to reread my own book, and it was fascinating. There's also a website you can go to, and you can basically put in the URL, and you can see the popular highlights of any book. And so now I've been reading all nonfiction with popular highlights on. And it's so interesting because in some ways it upsets me and degrades my faith in humanity because it's always the fortune cookie quotes that get highlighted the most. But I'm also like, those are also what gets tweeted, what gets shared, what gets talked about. And I almost want to go through my books and find the most highlighted things and do exactly what you said. Like you nailed it, right? Pull them out. If it's most highlighted, can I make it more condensed? Can I make it more quotable? More tweetable, because that is a big part of the viral loop that drives books these days.
You can also work it backwards. So if you already have books published, take those most popular highlights and just use them as content. Tweet them out on social media or make an Instagram post about it. Don't let all that value go to waste. Find a way to recycle your best ideas into content.
And also, even sneakier, read your competitors' books in the space or the big classic books, the foundational books that the current generation's books are built on top of. Find those quotes, right? We all borrow the quotes. And there's like the famous ones that everyone uses, but if you can find something that's catching readers' hearts that hasn't already been beaten to death by the rest of the publishing industry, then you found yourself a rare gem.
To what extent do you think internal layout designers have understood that they need to do this for the Kindle world?
And I think Chris is saying, like, within the constraints of ebooks, is there a way to do a really good job and nail it there?
Keeping your paragraph shorter, maybe 3 to 5 sentences. When I see a block of text that takes up like an entire page, it makes it really difficult to read and makes me feel like I'm not making that much progress. But if you have short chapters or even short paragraphs, you kind of get that feeling of making progress through a book, easier to read, easier on the eyes.
I really agree with the paragraph breaks. When I was teaching workshops a lot and giving a lot of public talks, I noticed that if I repeated something slowly, that was always what would get tweeted about my talk. It wasn't the phrase that was most interesting. It's the thing that I said twice where the second time was slower. And I feel like the paragraph breaks are a little bit the same, where if you break something down, it's just like, boom. I need to look through my books and think about this more intentionally with the extra information of both Twitter and most popular highlights. But I think it's potentially powerful. And another weird quirk of Kindle, I was reading Kindle books and I was noticing which ones I reviewed and which ones I didn't. So as you approach the end of a Kindle book, it automatically pops up the star rating. And I noticed that books with a long appendix, I never reviewed because that never got popped up automatically. And I didn't want to click through to the extra screens. Whereas books that just ended strong on a high note, it pops up, it goes, hey, you're done. What did you think? I'm like, loved it. I think appendixes might be an anti-pattern in the Kindle world because they dissuade reviews.
It's funny you bring that up because I noticed in Ryan Holiday's book, he'll just have one page that'll say, if you want the appendix, go to this website to find the rest. And maybe he does that so that way it's not 10 pages of information. It's just one page, and then you get that pop-up review.
So what is the ratio of part-time to full-time authors of successful books?
I can chip in real quick with a few numbers. 70% of traditionally published books never sell enough copies to pay a single dollar in royalties because they never pay out the advance. And so there's some authors who have abused that by basically negotiating high advances, and they live advance to advance. So like each advance is a year's salary and they churn out books. But honestly, it's low. My belief is that people aren't treating the books like products. They're not iterating. They're not engaging with their readers. And I think a lot more could be professional authors. To me, it's a process issue.
Most successful authors aren't full-time authors. You think of big names, maybe they wrote one or two good books. They're usually like either professors or researchers or successful business people. What I've heard, really hard to make a living at writing books is your only thing. Most of them use their books as marketing materials for workshops or talks, and that's where they make most of their money.
I see a copy of Hooked by Nir Eyal behind you, and Nir doesn't need to work anymore, right? He's been successful in business. He sold 1 million copies of his books, but he's curious. And he says his curiosity is what drives his success with his books, right? Because he gets an interesting question that hasn't been answered and he wants to chase it. But that can be curiosity also obviously compels him to continue doing other things with his life. Maybe it's different in fiction where the passion is the fiction books, but in nonfiction, the best nonfiction authors just can't stop because they're too curious about the world. They need to keep doing things. They need to keep learning things. And that's what allows them to write great nonfiction.
Being a nonfiction writer is one of the best jobs in the world. It's like you basically just get paid to read books, research them, and put together information into your own book.
Can I reasonably expect to create a good book on a side project effort, let's say?
That I would say definitely. The financials come and go. If you have a big author platform, you're basically levering up the financial success of your book because it's so much easier to get a big seed audience. But for example, I know Tendai Vicky, he works as a full-time university professor. He's also got a full-time job running innovation consulting, and he's written 3 best-selling books. Pirates in the Navy was the most recent, and he's got a family. He's got a wife. He's a very active dad. And the way he did it is he just said, okay, I need 2 hours per day. So every weekday, he puts 2 hours into his book and he gets each book done in a year. So he's written 3 books in 3 years with 2 hours a day. And they've all been bestsellers, award winners, very successful. And the only time he broke the 2 hours a day rule, he told me, is at the end, he sometimes has to just book into a hotel down the street from his house for 3 to 5 days to just have like an uninterrupted few days to do the final sprint. But yeah, apart from that, he's just got the process. You wrote a book, Alex. How was it for you? What was your experience there?
Well, I self-published my first book on Amazon, and it's really just like a quote book. So just took the best quotes on like the value of reading, the importance of reading from like successful people, everyone from like Elon Musk to like Ernest Hemingway to Naval Ravikant, and just put all these quotes on why you should read books into a book. So I would say it does not really compare to people who write like actual nonfiction books, stories, lessons, and all that. I feel like I kind of took a shortcut to writing a book. There's also dipping my toes into the self-publishing industry, so I thought it'd be good for this project.
And also, I think you did something really smart in that you get to choose the book you write. So for example, we were talking to Dr. Larry Jones a couple weeks ago, who has ADHD. I do also. And his version of it, he's very good in short spurts, but he has trouble with long ongoing projects. So the way they chose to structure the book, he and his wife wrote it together as co-authors. They wrote it where each chapter was completely standalone. So it didn't necessarily need to connect into one big narrative. And it was like chapter, chapter, chapter. So they could do it as 50 small projects instead of one gigantic project. So we get to choose which books we write and how we structure them, right? And I think it makes sense to pick a structure that's going to fit your time constraints and what you're good at. And I think you nailed that, Alex, right? Because you're like, I read books all day and pick out the interesting quotes. So let me write a book that aligns with that.
That was the secret behind it. And also people love sharing quotes on social media. Someone shared the quotes like, oh, what book is that from? It's not going to be the most in-depth or intellectually stimulating book, but I think marketing-wise and sales-wise, it'll do okay.
Absolutely. It's social media magic.
Going back to what you said about you'll give a book 3 chapters before you decide to keep reading it, what are the specific things that will turn you off?
So I really don't think there's that many bad books out there. I think there's a lot of bad matches out there. So it's really not the quality of the writing per se. It's like, is this book applicable to me? Is this something that I'm looking for right now in my life? There might be a fantastically written book, but if it's just not applicable to my situation or something I'm looking for, I'll return it or like give it away, but that doesn't mean it's a bad book. Personally, I have this rule when it comes to reading nonfiction books. It's called read it when you need it. So I look for books that I could read and apply right away or in the near future. Just a personal example. When I was single, I was reading a lot more dating books and like communication books. Now that I'm in a relationship, I read more books about how to maintain that relationship by like John Gottman and Julie Gottman. Is this book a match for me personally? And if not, then I put it away and I look for a different book.
Sometimes people ask me on Twitter, they go, Rob, I loved your books. What other books should I read? And my response is always like, well, what are you struggling with? What's your situation? What are your questions? I can't recommend a book in a vacuum.
Yeah.
I mean, I can recommend a novel or a comic book, but I can't recommend a business book without knowing like what your question is.
Whenever someone asks for book recommendations, to really give a good recommendations, you have to know what they like, what they already read, their situation, and you really need a lot more information from them than just, hey, what's the best book you read? Because the best books that changed my life won't necessarily change your life. You might be in a completely different situation. There's not that many, I would say, terrible books out there, because if you're going to publish a book, chances are you're going to get an editor put in a lot of time and effort into publishing it. It's just, is that book a good match for me or not?
I've noticed with some of the books I love the most and recommend the most, they have a bimodal pattern in their reviews where it's largely 5 stars plus like 10 to 20% 1 stars. And what I think is happening is exactly what you described. When people are at the right moment in their life, they love it so much, and then they start recommending it to everyone. And it catches some people who read it because of the strength of the recommendation, but they're not in that moment. And so they get no value and they go, what is this garbage? Seth Godin talked about this as well. He wrote a great little blog post called, What Does a 1-Star Review Mean? When someone makes the effort to go to your restaurant, to read your book, to buy your product, and then they say they hate it, what does it mean? And his judgment is just, you messed up your marketing and you made them think it was for them when it's not actually for them. It's for someone else. And that's why I think this exclusionary descriptive marketing language, like it is for this person in this situation, is actually really powerful because it gets that flywheel going.
I think you did a great job of that with your book. You tell people, hey, here's what you get from this book. If you're not looking for this, this is not going to be the book for you. And that way you kind of warn them ahead of time. And also you kind of discourage them from reading forward. And you also discourage them from finishing the book being like, oh, this book is not what I'm looking for. Let me leave a 1-star review. So the introduction should really lay out the map of what's to come and give people a heads up. Hey, this is what you could expect from the book. This is what you won't find. And if you're not looking for this information, this is not the book for you. And that's totally okay.
Ideally, the Amazon page does that. The introduction's a bit too late these days. That worked in bookstore days, but now we got to be super aggressive.
Sure.
I heard that also with fiction. I tried reading this genre called lit RPG. It's basically like books about video games. So the main character is playing a video game. Super nerdy, but I was like, I'm into that. I don't have time to play video games anymore, but I can read books about them. They're so unabashedly geeky from tip to tail. Every part of the cover, the description, because they're like 0 people who aren't into video games are going to read this book. And they don't want those people because they know those people will hate the books. It's really knowing who you're writing for and being okay with that and being okay with leaving other people out because you're serving someone.
If someone's given advice in a book, they have to have tested that advice out for it to be trustworthy. Like, would you trust an author who said, okay, I'm going to tell you the secret to financial wealth, and it's purely based on their own personal experience and they haven't gone out and thought at all?
If you have a personal story, I feel like I trust it more. If you read that book, Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins, he has a crazy story. He just talks about how his life, he went from 300 pounds going to like 195 and joining the Navy SEALs. If you have the evidence to prove it, he has pictures in the book, so it's hard to argue with that. If you have a personal story and you can back it up with proof, I think people will believe you.
It's weird to me the way the line gets drawn in it. It seems so topic specific. I think that's a great example, Alex. And another one that really strikes me where the personal story is so compelling is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. He was the lead FBI hostage negotiator and just has the most insane stories and experiences. I know a lot about business communication, right? Like I wrote a reasonably well-regarded book about it. When I read Chris Voss's book, he's talking about stuff that if a normal person said it to me, I'd be like, no, that's garbage. Don't even think about that. But because of Chris's personal experience, I have to take it seriously. And it's slippery stuff. It's like a lot of business books are plagued by the survivorship bias problem, where someone spent 10 years at a successful company and they write a book about how to be a successful company, but actually they've got one data point and they don't understand what's different about that data point compared to all the others, which I actually thought was one of my strengths when I first wrote my books, is that I'd like tried a lot of different stuff. So at least I had more than one data point, you know? And to me, also beta readers have always been happy to call bullshit on me. And especially the expert reviewer class of beta reader, I had some great ones in Workshop Survival Guide where people were just leaving comments like, I want to believe you, but this sets off my bullshit sensor. and stuff like that. And in the mom test, I had a beta reader who goes, "This is good advice, but chapters 2, 3, and 4 are kind of pretentious, aren't they?" And I was like, "Yep, you're right. All right, let me go fix that." And so for me, it's like I go in with best intentions, and then I try to frame it also. When I first wrote the mom test, I tried to say like, all I've ever done is fail. Like I'm not a successful business person. I don't know how to tell you how to run a successful business, but I do know how to do one piece that's involved in the creation of a successful business. Let me tell you about that piece. For me, that made me comfortable. And that's what got me around the imposter syndrome, was just being clear. I don't know how to climb the mountain, but I do know how to tie a good knot. Let me tell you about the knots and avoid the rest of the mountain climb.
To what extent do you think books will remain as books? And to what extent do you think that they will merge into some part of a kind of a hybrid learning platform where I'm looking on my Kindle and there's a link that I click to go do this, to download that?
A lot of authors, especially business authors, do already. They'll be like, hey, if you want more information on this, or you want a resource, or the book, The One Thing I just read, has a lot of great like additional resources, and you just go to the website, you print it out, they get your email in exchange for you getting like a free resource, which I think is a fair trade-off and something you would want to do because you want to have an email list of true fans you could always reach out to when you write a book. And I think people will appreciate you're making the book more interactive, more engaging. Don't just read this information. Here, get this resource and start like, applying it. So I think you're already seeing that more and more. A lot of books are like marketing materials for the author's workshop or their online course. Whereas if you thought the book was engaging, here, get the course, like go to the next level. And the level after that is in-person training. So I think you have this model of engagement established, and it's just that the more you're willing to pay, the more access you get with the author. Like the book's only $10, you don't get any access with the author. The course is like $100, you get to see them online. And then if you spend like $1,000 or $10,000, you get to be with the author in person.
Also, learners have a preferred learning style. I much prefer learning from a book than a video course because I feel like I'm able to access the information more quickly and retain it better. But then I sometimes upgrade to a video course if the book nailed it. And something Brennan said that was interesting, Alex just said it also, as you shift up the mediums from like book to video course to cohort-based live video training, you're basically adding a zero at each stage, at least. I think the audience size is dropping by an order of magnitude, but the pricing is increasing by an order of magnitude. So I've heard from other authors that only 5% of people do the upsell or 10%, but it doubles my overall profitability for the book. Of course, it adds a lot of tech complication also, because now you're managing your own website, your own pipeline, your own customer relationships, which normally as authors, we outsource largely to Amazon, for better or worse. It's certainly for worse from a profitability standpoint, but it's very convenient. It's powerful. If you want to build a whole business stack on top of a book, that's absolutely the way to do it. I know you got started on your reading due to a biking accident, right? You like ripped your arm off, something dramatic. You've really fallen in love with books since then, reading, writing, building the audience and the fan base around it. What does your future look like? What's the book you want to write? How do you imagine this going in the next few decades?
The holy grail I want to write is a sequel to the classic book, How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. So he teaches how to read a book from technical aspect and it's more fiction-based. I want to teach how to actually develop the habit of reading, how to find great books, anything from how to get more out of your books, how to take notes while you're reading, how to take notes while you're on a Kindle, on an audiobook, how to actually apply the information you're learning. All these things about like building a reading habit, being a lifelong reader. And that's why I've been sharing reading tips online. And that's my main focus now.
I love what you're doing because, books change lives and they're so impactful. And if you can get some of those people who read a book a year to read a little more enthusiastically, to get more out of it, to see more value in it, you're changing the world. If people want to be a part of your reading community, if they want to talk to you about potentially reaching your reader community through some sort of influencer marketing, where do we follow you? Where do we learn more about you?
So you could just search for Alex and Books on Instagram, on Twitter, on TikTok, YouTube. You can go to alexandbooks.com. I have a newsletter there where every week I share a book I read, 3 key lessons from it, and 3 ways to apply it. And then I just self-published my first book on Amazon. Love reading books, love talking about books. Yeah, so as a self-published author, don't worry too much about the narrative or even using specific grammar. Don't get too hung up on how you're explaining your story. As long as you have interesting information, I think readers will find it eye-catching and grabbing, and keep it short, cut out the fluff.